When I was a student in the New York City public school system, poetry was required every first semester of one's junior year. Now, needless to say, that is no longer the case. And I think somehow that we're feeling the chilling effects of not providing courses that may offer a humanizing influence on our youth. I mean, this is nothing you can really prove, which makes it so hard for the humanities to justify their existence. Although kids were always notorious for incidents of bullying, the stakes have risen over the years. Guns in the hands of students have increased in alarming ways. And the preoccupation with video games now, assimilating combat conditions and other action-packed, blatant forms of aggression are so commonplace that we don't even blink at the thought of it. My high school poetry teacher sat on an empty student desk, his feet planted on the chair folded down in front of him. The inkwell was covered. All desks bolted to the floor in neat rows of 8 down, 6 across. And so he was sitting on this desk. He was not trying to be cool, in fact, anything but cool. He sat there reading poetry, and oftentimes tears flowed down his cheeks because he was so transparently moved by the words, the message. Now, we students were a little uncomfortable, a little amazed at this, kind of bewildered, but never thought less of him, sitting so exposed in front of his students as though opening his heart for all of us to get a peek inside. We didn't understand the tears until he worked with us to get to the very heart of the poem's meaning, peeling off layers of poetic illusions we couldn't comprehend because of our youthful innocence, our ignorance. But that's how we'd learned. It's funny, so much of that would now be considered esoteric. But when the lines of Emily Dickinson, for example, were parsed with fresh insight and understanding, it felt like discovering a jewel buried in front of our nose. And our failure to grasp it pointed to our ignorance and our need to learn more of the secrets locked up in this vault called poetry. And I think that much of what we have gleaned really points to the punchline of our reading this morning about the back scratcher, that the human touch is more important to us than we realize, and that self-sufficiency and moving away from the bonds of community will ultimately perhaps lead to our downfall as a civilization. Poetry is definitely that human touch. Poetry provides that human touch. Now, in that time long ago, before social media, indeed before computers, and when rotary phones were the norm, it was not enough for my high school class to read Hamlet, but we had to read the first quarto of Hamlet. And even I protested in my 16-year-old way, arguing that the usual rendition of Hamlet was sufficient. Thank you very much. We didn't need to endure the first quarto on top of everything else. But the English teacher told me that it would make me a better person, and that someday I would boast that I was familiar with the first quarto of Hamlet. Well, today is my first opportunity to do exactly that. It all sorts, yeah, thanks. It took a few years. It reminds me of a Bill Cosby story when he was about 8 years old, and Duke Ellington came to town and his father made him go. Young Bill put up quite a fight, refusing to have anything to do with his music from another generation. But the father made it clear this was not up for discussion. And of course, the father prevailed, and off they went to hear the Duke. And Cosby remarked, of course, much later in his adult years, how fortunate he was that his dad insisted he go. And he thanked his dad for having persevered. For he says now, upon reflection, that to have missed Duke Ellington in person would have left a huge hole in his life. It's hard to explain. I mean, I think we'd all agree that Cosby would be just as gifted and humorous today had he not heard Duke Ellington. But the experiences one has sort of all add up to make you distinctly you. And Cosby was saying that, in an almost mystical sense, he wouldn't be the same person had he not heard Duke Ellington that night. W.H. Auden wrote a dream curriculum for a college of bards. He writes, the curriculum would be as follows. In addition to English, at least one ancient language and 2 modern languages are required. Thousands of lines of poetry in these languages learned by heart. And what I found most curious at first about this College of Bards, but now I certainly understand what he meant in retrospect. He says, every student would be required to look after a domestic animal and cultivate a garden plot. Well, following up on that, a professor of English, the University of Florida, William Logan, took Auden to heart and designed not a college course, but a curriculum for elementary school kids. And I can't help but wonder, as Utah grapples with these volatile issues around testing and teaching to the Common Core or SAGE, satisfying this standard or that, whether Utah educators would even consider Professor Logan's 9 points requiring all children to learn 1, the times table up to 25, a foreign language, preferably obscure, the geography of a foreign land, like New Jersey, how to use basic hand tools and cook a cassoulet, how to raise a bird or lizard. If the child is vegetarian, then how to raise a potato. 7, poems by heart, say 1 per week. Singing, somersaults. And then he concludes, with all that out of the way by age 12, there's no telling what children might do. No telling what children might do, and just by posing that question, Logan has a different agenda, or at least a different goal in mind than today's emphasis on acquiring technical skills for a career. The common perception today is that the humanities don't offer people much that is practical. I mean, reading the first quarto of Hamlet fails to be relevant for today's employment as let's say, a computer programmer. So why bother? Before the digital age, The humanities and the sciences were not really that mutually exclusive. They complemented each other as tools for building a broad understanding of life's mysteries, its wonders, and accessing knowledge indispensable for enriching and nurturing the human mind and soul. There was value in exploring both what it meant to be human through literature, history, and art, and exploring the boundaries of the universe through physics, chemistry, and biology. However, the decline in student interest in the humanities over the last number of years raises some perplexing questions and concerns for me personally. There have always been debates within universities as to the legitimacy and relevance of certain departments in the humanities. I mean, let's face it, it's tough to make a living as a poet. It's tough to make a living as a philosopher. Yet, is that the purpose of higher education? To prepare young people for work, period? Exclusively, that's all they need to do, to prepare the young people for work? In our elite institutions, from Harvard to Stanford, there has been a 35% drop in students concentrating in English or history. That 35% drop occurred between 2006 and 2012. And a report issued just last year in 2013 revealed a 50% attrition rate among Harvard students who, as pre-freshmen, had expressed an intention to concentrate in the humanities. So they had every reason to go into the humanities before entering college, and then as they were in college, can you imagine a drop-off of 50% in the humanities? It appears extremely difficult these days for the humanities to keep pace with the lives of students who are fixated on acquiring the tools needed to enter the job market in a highly competitive economy in this digital age. Our present culture has quickly emerged as one based on computerized information, which leads to a high-tech global economy, so on and so forth. Thus, our curriculum, designed for secondary education, wishes for students to be, well, prepared for college. Prepared for college not by memorizing poems in obscure languages, but by gaining a head start in technology, math, and science, which would preclude the so-called esoteric subjects like art and music. English and history might receive some obligatory attention, but, we can all agree that nobody cares much anymore about the geography of New Jersey or cultivating a plot of land. Now, hoping not to sound too much like an apologist for the humanities, I still need to raise the question, what exactly will help students build a meaningful life? Am I fooling myself in the belief that learning about Aristotle, Hart Crane, Shakespeare, Mozart, Modigliani actually adds meaning to our lives, as opposed to acquiring a skill set in technology, computer science? Now, someone like the great philosophical novelist Walker Percy may have exaggerated this a little, but his point of view resonates with me nonetheless. Walker Percy, as you probably know, raised mostly in Louisiana and a great literary voice of the South. He felt he understood the difference between arts and science. Initially, he trained as a physician in order to become a psychiatrist, but woke up one morning with an epiphany. He realized the limits of science because science can't teach us anything worth knowing about the human mind. Its yearnings, depression, leaps of faith. So he became a storyteller. Imagine that. He abandoned psychiatry for storytelling. For Walker Percy, storytelling was a humanist way of making sense of data. I mean, science gives us empirical facts, he said, and theories. Science gives us theories to tie all these strands together. Humans turn them into narratives with moral, emotional, and spiritual meaning. He further said, there are two types of people who come out of Louisiana: preachers and storytellers. For goodness sakes, be a storyteller. The world has too many preachers as is. Doesn't storytelling provide a tonic for the barrage of information from the digital world? I mean, how do we make sense of all this information? And this is where Peter Sachs, an English professor at Harvard, asserts that the humanities are the preeminent science of interpretation. The science of interpretation. The humanities, through literature, the classics, modern languages, philosophy, use interpretation to create a whole world of associations, contexts, values. Interpretation, he stressed, is therefore an activity that through the exercise of judgment about important works of art, literature, music, sculpture, architecture, etc., creates social and cultural values. We need those values. And therefore the humanities help us to become not just political citizens, not social citizens, not citizens in a legal sense, but cultural citizens. Now that's the real force, that's the real impetus of the humanities, for us to emerge as cultural citizens. And perhaps that's the source of my discomfort and disease, and possibly yours too. As we get technically more savvy, do you find that we're losing a sense of culture? You know, all those things worth knowing that won't land us a job. So are they still worth knowing? And so Peter Sachs expresses out loud the need provided by the humanities to create this world of associations and values. If not for the humanities, how else will we remain connected with the past and integrate the human concerns that were always expressed throughout history? How do we integrate those into our present awareness and consciousness? Is there no value in piecing together all that makes us human historically? Our common heart and emotions and fears and wants and concerns? I mean, for example, without a grounding in the humanities, how would the words of W.H. Auden about the beginnings of World War II deliver to us today a mournfulness so poignant to our grappling today with issues, what happened just a few years ago, the collapse of the World Trade Towers in 9/11. His view in poetry makes sense to us if we listen, if we know, if we learn. Because being familiar with Auden's poem, September 1st, 1939, we can share a similar horror of the historical beginnings of World War II. And ironically, Auden's poem even takes place in New York City, where he writes, "I sit in one of those dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid." He writes that the unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. History has driven a culture mad, And although blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man, he concludes there's no disguising the fragility of civilization when he writes, "Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies." And ironically, the one line quoted most often as the one is the one that he really detested the most. He said, "It's just too sappy. I wish I never wrote it." But this is the one that we grab onto. It's the line in that poem which says, "We must love one another or die." That was true then, that's true now, it's true historically. Whatever century you want to point to, we must love one another or die. There it is. Now, can I lead a complete life without knowing W.H. Auden? Probably. I mean, I think I could still make a living, get married, have children, buy a house, and remember to roll out the garbage for Monday's early morning pickup. If I missed the thread linking past human despair to the present world, if I missed those connections, would I somehow be different? I think so. Wouldn't you? I cannot even imagine a life that fails to examine ethics or remains oblivious to the emotional dimensions of every discipline touched by the humanities. I mean, how can educators today dismiss the literature that reveals why people behave the way they do? Human foibles expressed in literary form for thousands of years, now considered irrelevant. And how do we learn then? How do we learn to express our own ideas, if not by learning the principles of good writing? Now, I don't buy the argument that the world is so different now because of smartphones, texting, Twitter, Facebook. These represent the earmarks of a changing world. But don't we still need to develop skills in critical thinking and interpretation, making sense of things? Utah, just was it last week, was horrified to learn how poorly its students perform in critical thinking. But you know, what do they expect? When the school means memorizing data while ignoring the tools to assess ideas. Diana Sorensen, not exactly a household name, a woman who works really hard because many of the prestigious colleges, she tries to lure students into the humanities, and she frames the humanities, and this is the best, most succinct, wonderful definition or understanding of the humanities I have ever come across. She describes the humanities as a dense conversation through time. Isn't that wonderful? A dense conversation through time. To build a meaningful life, we must be able to analyze the allusions and references and echoes of the past. In a sense, be a part of that conversation. Be a part of the conversation with Shakespeare, Joyce, Tolstoy. I mean, people have been grappling with issues like war and love for a very long time. We can only be enriched by joining that community, joining that conversation already in progress. I'm not trying to romanticize the humanities nor discredit the information age, no. But I believe we do a disservice to students by eliminating their basic understanding of culture. And by that I mean, for them to understand what it means to live in a larger world. And the funny thing is, philosophers have a lot to say about that. And by calling that irrelevant, we fail to sharpen the analytical and critical tools we'll need in order to act responsibly towards future generations. Global warming, for example, is not just a matter of reading data, but we must be able to tap into our human capacity to care for a plot of land. So yeah, I worry for our future. And I believe, pretty much along the same lines of our reading this morning, that the digital information is poor compensation for the gentle touch of a human living